Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast. This is episode 210, How Purity Culture Affected Men.
I can't wait for this conversation. Yeah, guys, welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast, where we talk about how the gospel is good news for every man and woman every day. We're coming at you from the lovely WCSG radio studio in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm your host, Lori Krieg, and I have via Zoom. So we might sound a little different if you guys just listen. My husband and favorite licensed therapist, Matt Krieg. Hey, Matt.
Hey.
I feel like we're like, how's the weather over there in England? I feel to our BBC correspondent. We don't usually have you in another spot, but he's actually with one of our children who's not feeling great. But thanks so much for being with us via Zoom. We needed more guys to have this conversation with us. So thanks for making this happen, Matt.
Mm-hmm. Excited to be here.
And I also have alongside me another guy and my friend and the most professional radio voice among us, producer Steve.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Steve.
Hey.
Guys, we are today going to continue a conversation. We have not had a conversation with this particular guest yet, but we have begun the purity culture conversation. How can we take apart things from those decades that are unhelpful? And is there anything we can distill down that we can take into the future? How can we talk about purity culture? But specifically today, we're going to talk about how it affected and still can have an effect on men. And to do this, we're inviting a new friend of the podcast to talk with us about it. And his name is Zachary Wagner. Zach, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So
when you referenced the weather in England at first, I thought you might have been talking about me because I am, in fact, as we speak, in England. But,
oh my goodness! So,
wow.
Can you give us a weather update of that?
It is about what you would think. It is. Overcast and a little windy. Just a tiny bit of rain this morning when I was taking our kids to school. But it is very traditional English weather outside right now.
Feels that way here too.
Yeah.
So we got to understand where you're from, more of what you're about. Can you help us, Steve?
So Zach is a writer, researcher, ordained minister, thinker of thoughts, and feeler of feelings.
Yeah.
Originally from the Chicagoland area, he now lives in Oxford, England, where he's pursuing a DPhil, PhD in New Testament studies at Keble College, University of Oxford. He also serves as the editorial director of the Center for Pastor Theologians, where he co-hosts the CPT podcast.
That's awesome. Matt, are you going to intro the question of the week, even from your correspondent spot?
Yes, from the lovely not basement studio of our house. We want to get to know Zach a little bit better. And so we want to ask the question of the week from last time, which is, what time of day do you often look at the clock and it, because of that, perpetually feels like it is that time of day as a result?
I think I saw this in the email, and I'm not sure I immediately understand what the question is asking. Can you give it to me? From a different angle, maybe?
Yeah. Is there a time of day that you feel like you're always looking at the clock? You're like, oh, I need to look at the clock at this time. And it just happens to always be like 9:15 in the morning when you've been with kids and feel like it should be the afternoon.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Yes, I would say around 11 a.m. For some reason, I always feel like time gets stuck around 11 a.m.
There it is.
And I think part of that is because I split my day kind of in half. When I'm doing my work and my writing and my reading and research for my PhD, I have a chunk of things I'm always trying to get done in the morning. It includes getting the kids out the door for school, working on various things. And then I take kind of a long lunch in the middle of the day where I like to eat lunch as well as exercise in some way, also in the middle of the day. And for some reason, I feel like 11 a.m. both takes forever to get here and comes way too soon. And every day it's just like I have this weird relationship with 11 a.m. because I like to cut my day off at that point to go take a break and go exercise and then eat lunch, and it can both not get here soon enough and takes forever to get here. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
The disorientation you're describing around a time of day, the one that comes to mind is 11 a.m.
You answered the question perfectly. That's exactly what I was looking for.
No, that's great. It took me a second
stuck.
to kind of click, but I think I got it.
Yeah, I liked this answer. Can we play it? Yes, this is my sister, and she's probably going to make fun of me. Let's go.
Hi, this is Angela from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I have 2 small kids that keep me very active. So the time that I see very often on the clock is about 10:45 in the morning, expecting it to be at least 4:45, at least, because of how tired I am. And I love my kids and I love spending time with them, but I am like, it's gotta be late afternoon. It's gotta be. And I'm like, what? It's still morning? Are you kidding me? So, real life.
That's my sister and neighbor, and I'm not kidding. We'll sit in her driveway. So I'll just walk down there, and people will be like, "What are you guys doing?" I'm like, literally waiting until it's 4:00 and I can make dinner.
Just
it's
killing
real life,
time.
guys. Kinda. Sometimes it is. Steve, which listener answer stood out to you?
I appreciated this from Facebook. Sarah said, one of my roommates in college always liked 12:34. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I feel like I always see that time on the clock, mostly when I'm up too late. So that would be 12:34 a.m., I guess.
That's awesome.
So that was cute. 1, 2, 3, 4.
1, 2, 3, 4. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, I liked what Kimi said on Instagram multiple times, though I long for kids' bedtime, which is around 8 p.m.
Moral of the story is, guys, we love our kids, and also we need a break. All right, let's pivot to the heart of the matter. Zach, we ask every guest this question. If the gospel is we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe, yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. How is that gospel first good news for you, and how is it still?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, and I remember the way the gospel was first articulated to me as like a 5-year-old or something like that was this ABC: admit that you're a sinner, believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sins. And I've heard it confess, but I learned it choose to invite Jesus into your heart or something like that. Huh. And I think by temperament, and a lot of people perhaps will relate to this, I didn't need a lot of help feeling like I was broken and bad. Like I kind of had that as a default feeling inside of me. But I would say even coming into adulthood and including the journey around this book and writing it, that you are more loved than you can possibly believe. To me, that's the good news. The good news it's not good news that you're actually like more broken and sinful than you might think. That's bad news.
Right.
So the good news is that despite whatever you do, the goodness that God has announced over your life, and for me personally, the fact that God made me, and despite my brokenness, continues to love and cherish me. And my brokenness does not compromise his love for me. That's really, really transformative, it seems to me.
I feel that.
Mm-hmm. So the book you were referring to,
we got it right here for those of you watching.
Yep.
Non-Toxic Masculinity, Recovering Healthy Male Sexuality.
So toxic masculinity is something we hear tossed around a lot. How would you define that? What is toxic masculinity?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways. It's one of these buzzwords that everyone kind of has their own idea, their own definition of what it means, and you could Google something and find out. The way I define it in the book is it's a way of living as a man, or living out your male embodiment, in a way that dehumanizes either others or dehumanizes yourself. So it's a way of living as a man that dehumanizes self and or others. And what I'm trying to seize on there is the language of toxic. We have associations with poison or death or illness or disease. And that is what I'm trying to capture with the dehumanization language. It's something that makes you less than yourself or less than the fully human person you were created to be, or treats others or thinks about others in a similarly dehumanizing way that is not tending towards life, but tending towards poison, death, brokenness.
That makes sense.
So with that kind of working definition of, toxic masculinity and everything, where do you feel like that was, I don't know, cultivated, whether it's in our culture or just in human history? Like, when did that become the predominant or kind of common masculinity that people talk about and see?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's one single way of being toxic in the world in this way that I've defined it. Something I talk about a little bit in the book is this idea, just the objective reality of embodied differences between men and women. To generalize, can be summarized that men tend to be larger and stronger than women. And, it's not to say that every man is stronger than every woman. Of course not. We all the kind of qualifiers that we all get, we don't do, but it's not a controversial thing to say that men in general are stronger and larger. And I think when you add to that, it's not wrong or evil to be stronger and larger than another person. But when you add to that the brokenness and the bentness of sin, it puts men at a unique advantage isn't quite the right word, but in a certain way, but I describe it as a male embodied advantage, whereas men are in a position to leverage their physical strength, whether as individuals or as a collective, to selfish ends. And the selfish ends are the ingredient that is added with sin. So, not to be like too cliche or generic, but it is sin. It is something that sin bends men to leverage their embodied differences in a way that harm others, or their embodied advantages, you might say, in a way that harms others. And that's been manifested in various cultures in various ways all throughout human history. So, you can give specifics, but I think we understand the ways that most societies are patriarchal and have been in one way or another. And that often includes a preference for what an individual man with a great deal of power or men as a collective would like to see happen in society, because they are in a position to assert that in a way that women tend to not have the same access to. So this created difference bends in a toxic way because of sin. And it is not wrong or evil to be a man. In fact, as Christians, we would want to strongly say that that could not be the case, because all human beings are created in the image of God and created good. But I do think there's a unique way in which sin affects and gives certain temptations to men as individuals and as a group.
Okay. So that makes sense. Toxic masculinity, it dehumanizes self and or others. And it, in its praxis, in its lived out mode, men can leverage their strength to selfish ends. This is how we see toxicity. How does that relate to purity culture? Can you kind of give us a little overarching for people I don't even know what that is? Can you talk, what is purity culture? And then how does what you're talking about, toxicity for men specifically, relate to purity culture?
Sure. So purity culture, I define in the book as the theological perspectives, rhetorical strategies, discipleship resources, an entire slew of things created or articulated by predominantly white evangelical Christians in the United States, although it's certainly exported elsewhere, in response to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
So purity culture is a subcultural movement in response to or reaction against a broader cultural movement, i.e. the sexual revolution. And I think it really, got going in the late 80s, really rose to prominence in the 90s with things like True Love Waits, some people might remember.
Yep.
And somewhat unfairly sometimes, but the poster boy of purity culture is often Joshua Harris, who wrote best-selling I Kissed Dating Goodbye in the, it's either like 99 or 2001 that book came out. That's escaping me off the top of my head, but it sold over 1 million copies. Very, very influential and popular book to people who grew up in that time. And then many other books and resources associated with this. And purity culture emphasized a couple things. It emphasized the kind of right context of sex being in a marriage between a man and a woman, and also tended to emphasize the fact that holding off on quote unquote premarital sex was a way to maximize your future sexual fulfillment or get your best sex life in marriage.
Yeah.
This was a very strong message that many young people received who grew up in the church. Not everybody, it's not uniform, and people received it in different ways and to different extents. Some that perhaps were not really all that harmful, or and others that I think a lot of people carry a lot of baggage from. So it's strong emphasis on waiting until marriage, a strong emphasis on God's plan for your romantic life, or the best way to date, or the biblical way to date, all these sorts of things. And now to get to the second part of your question on how this connects to men and toxic masculinity. Pretty shot through lots of purity cultural resources and rhetoric are these assumptions about male identity.
Yep.
Where men are viewed as being hypersexual or hypererotic or hyper quote unquote visual in their just kind of orientation towards the world. So it perpetuates you might call it a script of masculinity or a vision of masculinity that is hypererotic, I argue. And when a very influential book on the male side of purity culture is the book Every Man's Battle.
Yep.
Which pretty much frames masculinity in these terms, to say if you're a man or a boy and you find yourself distracted by the women around you or the girls, if they're dressed a certain way or someone's out jogging, all these sorts of things, and these are the illustrations that the book uses. Yeah. That's just the way God made you. That's part of being male. Men more or less can't help but be distracted by or sexualized visually. That's just the way it goes. And there's a lot of kind of really suspicious, I'm not sure how charitable that is, but there's certain kind of quote unquote scientific data used to back that up in that book and other books similarly. But man, that I think is a really unhelpful message to perpetuate to Christian young men. As they're thinking about what it means to be a godly man, you kind of say, well, by default, you're just going to be thinking about sex all the time. And anyone you interact with, you'll be, I don't know, if you're sexually attracted to them, you're like undressing them in your mind or something like that, is the language that's sometimes used in this. And you can see here, as well-intentioned as these resources were, I fear that they sometimes created a self-fulfilling prophecy where a toxic version of masculinity from the broader culture, this stereotype that men only think about one thing,
right,
is in a subtle way, and this is how the enemy works sometimes. In a subtle way, that message gets baptized and Christianized, and it's turned into this way that God made men, not something that men should mature out of, or learn to qualify and moderate and treat others as human beings, not as objects. So to get back to the dehumanization piece, of course, these ways of thinking about and talking about women, as I already said, it conceives of women as merely sex objects or potential sexual partners or sexual threats, like she's trying to flirt with me or sleep with me, or why is she dressed that way? All of this sort of thing is objectifying women, right, and dehumanizing them. But what I try to argue in the book, and I don't think this is talked about quite enough, is it also reduces men to like sexual animals.
Totally.
Which makes them less than human. It doesn't set a bar very high for men in the way they mature into an expression of their sexuality. It actually just says, well, what can you do? This is just what it's like to be a dude. You're going to be really, the wind blows the right way and you're just thinking about sex. And that you're kind of helpless and hopelessly bent that way because that's the way God created men. And that can lead to a lot of problems. I've talked for a while on that question, so I'll stop there and invite you to respond.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'm thinking about, and I'm relating with a lot of what you're saying, and have experienced, a lot of the kind of effects of that culture and of that message. Would you be willing to talk about like how it personally affected you, Zach? Like what, why, how did you get to this point of like realizing what you're now realizing? And was it like a personal journey that you were on?
Sure. Yeah. So generationally, I think a lot of young men who grew up in the church were receiving these types of message, this type of way of thinking about women or about sexuality that you might think of like a recovering sex addict as describing this way. And we're articulating this vision of masculinity to like 10-year-old boys before they even hit puberty. And they're like, okay, this is what's coming down the line. And that's certainly what was shaped for me. I was reading these books, I was thinking about these things, receiving these messages at various places before I even hit puberty. So I kind of like saw my sexuality kind of coming over the horizon as this terrifying thing, and this part of myself that was going to destroy me, was extremely dangerous, could ruin my life, made my experience of God or my Christian faith a farce if I were to mess up in this way. And the other thing that purity culture did, again, well-intentioned, is it set this weirdly low bar for men, as I've already said, but it also set like a very high bar of like perfectionism for you need to be as pure, quote unquote, as you possibly can be for your future spouse, or else you're a rose where all the petals have fallen off, or you're a piece of tape that's been stuck to too many things, or you're a chewed up piece of gum. All of these like really horrific analogies, actually. And I think women got the worst of that in a certain way. But I think what men, and certainly me personally, internalized is the sense that my sexual desire is like this worst thing about me. Like it's not a created good, even though you're taught that sex is a good thing. It's only good out there in some future marriage. My sexuality per se is not a good and beautiful created part of me that God delights in. It's only something that God is kind of grossed out by and is wondering how long it's going to take for you to get your crap together before you can keep it in your pants, until you get married or something like that. And that, for me and for many men that I've talked to, even in doing the interviews for this book, led to cycles of shame. And certainly with exposure to pornography, which was becoming much more easily accessible in the years when I was growing up through high-speed internet and smartphones and things like that. I mean, smartphones were, I guess, a little further down the line. That would have been later in my life. But I mean, even so, these were creating huge challenges for young people around this stuff. And then the second piece is purity culture, as I already said, held out this promise of a beautiful, fulfilling sex life and marriage. And now that many people who grew up hearing that message, it provided you wait until marriage, your sex life and marriage will be really great. A lot of young people who grew up hearing that message now are married. And even if they quote unquote follow the rules, as my wife Shelby and I not more or less, we did, like we were virgins on our wedding night, and we weren't perfect by any means, but we made it, and have found in the early years of our marriage, we had found that part of our relationship was more characterized by struggle and frustration and continuing cycles of shame than it was by this kind of joy and freedom and easy flow of intimacy that we were hoping for and had been led to expect in a certain way. And that leads to a unique confusion and frustration where you're like, okay, did I do something wrong? Or did I not follow the rules well enough? Or is there something wrong with me? And that can be experienced on both sides of the equation in various ways in a marriage. And I think purity culture was overly formulaic in its way of thinking about human sexuality and about relationships, where it's just do this and this and this, and you'll get a good result. Yeah. But that's just not how life works in a broken world. And something I talk about in the book is two pieces of that. One was kind of my continuing cycles of shame around my sexuality and my that kind of wound and weight that I was carrying there. And then for my wife, and she's very open about this and gives me consent to share in this way here and in the book, she's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, church-based childhood sexual abuse. And we didn't really grasp that and understand that early in our marriage. It took us a while to kind of put some of those pieces together, but that's a huge piece. And it wasn't something that she chose, but nevertheless, it was a burden and a weight that she brought into the marriage that the purity culture kind of narrative didn't often account for.
So Matt and I are just going to go have a little weep fest in relating to y'all. But Matt, I know you've got probably 25 burning questions and many client stories. So go for whatever you want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up kind of the porn piece, because so much of, I mean, I work with clients who are not from a Christian background at all. And I mean, there is this rhetoric where, if I'm working with a couple and the guy is literally saying to me, well, as a man, I have to look at half naked girls on TikTok or whatever, because that's what men do. And like, that is some of the sexual revolution message, that kind of animalistic man. And then coupled with the purity culture, which inadvertently does dehumanize women, that all relationships between men and women have to have this sexual component, and are either a danger or, everything you said, that is the primary drive, is just, I guess with that dehumanization, have you seen, or have you experienced, or how have you shifted your mind, to approach relationships specifically with women in a way that is not as this animalistic consumer, but much more in a human to human creative producer of maybe something good.
Yeah. I mean, I love what you said. And I think it's so important for these conversations is the way I think through the sexual revolution and through the way Christianity in purity culture adopted some of the harmful messages of the sexual revolution, which is this eroticizing of all relationships, where it's not that there's potential for men and women to partner in a sexual union. It's kind of like that's the sum total of what it means for a man and a woman to be in relationships. So if there's not potential for a sexual partnership or a marriage, then why bother being friends with that person? And this is strangely a very pornified view of relationships. You know, there aren't extras in pornography. Everybody is there for a sexual encounter. There aren't built out relationships outside of the sexual encounter in pornography. Everything is kind of eroticized and made into the sum total of what it means to be human and to be in relationship with another person is this erotic moment, or this erotic experience. And that's just a terribly narrow view of human relationships. And so that's just to kind of agree with what you're saying. And I think for me, learning through some work with a good therapist to understand my sexuality as one, a good part of me, something that's not just every time I experience sexual desire or sexual gratification or something like that. It's not something terrible about me, number one. So learning to like bless that part of myself, that was something that I really struggled to do. Number two was learning that that was actually, in fact, just a part of myself, not the sum total of what it means to be human or what it means to be a man. And I think in this purity culture narrative that I had received, as well as this kind of, this is just what men do, which in a weird way you can kind of adopt even within the context of purity culture. If you're struggling with watching porn, or you find you're compulsively acting out that way, there are different dynamics and stigmas for women who have that struggle. But for men, there can be this rut that you get into where you're like, well, this is just what it means to be a guy. Right. I'm just, following my programming. And I think we don't want to encourage that thinking in Christian men. We want to, and Christian boys for that matter, we want to say, if you find yourself experiencing your sexuality as this kind of overwhelming thing that you can't control, that's fine in a way, but like, let's move beyond that. That's not what it means to be a man. That's not what it means to be human. So starting to question some of those categories and fight back against the vision of myself as this kind of out of control sexual animal, just bit by bit. That's a long process, number one. Number two is, I talk about in the book, there was this really formative experience where my wife and we shared a home with two women who were peers of ours, two single women. We had an extra bedroom. They were looking for somewhere to stay, and we ended up saying like, oh, well, you can crash with us for a little bit. And it ended up becoming this thing where they lived with us for 2 years. And this wasn't like a kind of like charity arrangement sort of thing where it's like, oh, they're down on their luck, why don't we bring them in sort of thing. It was actually a blended kind of family type situation where, I was in a house at the time with 4 other women, one of whom was my wife, one of whom was my 1-year-old daughter, and then 2 other women who were my wife and I's age and peers, but were, I don't want to say just friends, as in they, one was my wife and the other were just friends. I suppose that's a fair distinction. But all of us were brothers and sisters in that community. Yeah. And it created a really beautiful context. And this was at this point in that healing journey where, for me, I found that it wasn't like weird, and it wasn't this like struggle, and it wasn't this dangerous thing for me to be in relationship with women. It felt extremely and I wasn't even afraid of those things. I found it was just this beautiful thing, living with people that I enjoyed and wanted to be in relationship with. And people expressed concern about that, and I'm not saying, throw any boundaries in relationship or living situations to the wind. Of course, there are things that can happen. But I think oftentimes purity culture had a tendency to over-legislate boundaries in a way that actually perpetuates this hypersexualization of relationships on the one hand, and also keeps us locked out of authentic relationships with men and women, which, as we all know, is so crucial for living life and healing and all sorts of things. You can't live life with only superficial relationships much less with relationships with the opposite sex.
Well, and it's the antithesis of the kingdom of God. Like, I'm
Correct.
in a church class right now, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is how God has designed it for us to be brothers and sisters advancing this kingdom of God thing. And so it's funny how something well-meaning turned men into animals, women into objects, and really the enemy used a decent amount to...
Well, and I mean, dangerous objects.
Yeah.
If
Correct.
men want to live holy lives, you know, the message is you're messing with my discipleship.
Which that's enmity between the man and the woman.
Right. Yeah.
It's the OG issue. Can you, though, you alluded to this earlier, and I just know it was pounded into my head, like a lot from my church community, was every man's battle. They are more visual. So how do you look at that science, or is it more air quote science of men are more visual? And can you just talk about it one more time?
Sure. Yeah. So there are, in my book, I make reference to the work of Sheila Gregoire and her team in the Great Sex Rescue, and they do some work on this and debunk some of it to some extent. Here's the thing. There are, in fact, scientific studies, and I'm just not qualified to evaluate them one way or the other. That's kind of why I allude to Sheila Gregoire and her team. They're in a better position to assess this than I am. It's not my expertise. But one important point that they make is that it just doesn't track that women aren't visual, which I think is the other side of that equation oftentimes, is that men are visual and women aren't. And it can be scientifically demonstrated that women are visual too, and often have the same types of visual associations with eroticism and things like that we associate with men oftentimes. But here's what I do want to say is that two things. I kind of don't care what the science says, in the sense that it's not like, oh, well, it's irrelevant what kind of biological differences there are between men and women. Of course, that's something that we can get curious about and can think through. What I get really nervous about is the way this gets hammered into, as you were saying, Lori, not just men's heads, but women's heads. And it then becomes license for men to lust after and eroticize women in the way they view and think about them.
Right.
And it becomes expectation on the women's side that men are treating me this way or thinking about me this way. And it then becomes my responsibility to make sure that they're not mentally engaging me in a violent way or physically engaging me in a violent or coercive way, or whatever the case may be. It just puts all that there. So it's not really like a moral statement. It's just a kind of moral shrug, I suppose, is how it comes across. And it's like, well, men are visual. What can you do?
Exactly.
And it just throws a wrench into all sorts of things. That's number one. Number two, and I guess I already alluded to this a little bit, is that the every man's in front of that is really, really problematic, it seems to me. Because it may be the case, and again, I'm not making a claim in this way, I just am not qualified to contest the claim, that men tend to think about sex more, or men tend to visualize having sex more, or something like that. But that is not true of all men. And it may, in fact, be true of some women, that they feel that they are more easily visually stimulated than, or think about sex more than the women around them, or even their partner in marriage. And that can create this script where if a woman then desires sex or finds she's visually stimulated in a certain way, she feels like she's fulfilling the man's role or acting in an unfeminine way.
Right.
And it is not male to be sexual. It is human to be sexual. And for every man you could point to and be like, well, that guy is very visual. Not that you can point to this sort of thing, but you would also be able to produce an example of a woman who is perhaps even more visual than that guy, or whatever the case may be. So it's just a kind of, I'm trying to disentangle and dismantle that framing of it a little bit, because I just don't see what good it does us other than lower the bar for men, raise the bar in a kind of unfair way for women,
right,
and make them responsible for men's sins and men's compulsion. Well, I don't think we should be telling young men like, hey, you're visual, this is just kind of how it goes. You should be like, hey, if you find yourself visually sinning against other people, you need to stop treating them like objects and start treating them like humans. And it's not wrong to notice that someone is attractive. It's not wrong to even experience sexual arousal in certain contexts, or those aren't bad things about you, but you are responsible for what you do with those feelings and those stimuli. That's where the moral framework comes in. And that's just not the way the discussion went so often. So yeah, there talked about it a little more.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just, to restate for the women in the room listening, it both turns us into the policeman for men. They can't help themselves. And again, I'm not saying this is true. This is how it came out. We're both the police, and we're perpetually need to get used to being the victim. And then men are a victim to themselves. So I love how you restated and you said, nope, the responsibility is on the man. And the woman, you are neither the victim you can be a victim, but you don't have to be perpetually the victim and the police. You're responsible for you. And we're all interdependent. What you got, Steve?
Well, I mean, it's so much. I feel like we're pressed for time. I wish that this could be a 3-hour podcast, because I'm thinking about, I'm a little bit on the older end of us. And I hope that maybe there's a guy roughly my age listening to this podcast, and maybe who had a similar experience to me during that sexual revolution and kind of like the emergence of, the pornography that's now proliferated the way it is. There was silence. And, again, this was like fundamental evangelical, bubble. There was silence on sexuality. And so we were left to figure things out. And I think maybe my generation grew up and went through what it took to recover from that and said, okay, we're not going to be silent. Our kids are going to hear about this. We're going to talk about this. And we pendulum swung to the other extreme, which we now call purity culture, because we took some of the messages we picked up from the sexual revolution and porn culture and believed it and spoke to that in a, like you said, in a kind of like an attempt to sanctify it and Christianize it. And so we're at least going to have this conversation. So I guess my question is, how can we have the conversation? Because I think that's a good thing. How can we talk to our kids and our sons, especially, about purity and masculinity or sexual integrity, however you want to say it? Like, how do we have the conversation without all the bad stuff we borrowed from the sexual revolution?
Yeah, this is what I try to do in the second half of the book, where I have this narrative that I trace chapter by chapter through different stages of a man's life, starting from childhood up to adolescence to adulthood to dating, marriage. And I actually end the last chapter is entitled Death and Resurrection. And what I'm trying to do there is situate our humanity and our sexuality in a salvation historical frame, a more redemptive frame. And I don't think the gospel actually had a whole lot to do with purity culture. And it's actually very anti-gospel in certain ways, because it creates this very high, quote unquote, legalistic bar that feels impossible to meet sometimes, where you're somehow supposed to have arrive at your wedding night having never felt a sexual feeling or thought a sexual thought. And then somehow that will not cause more problems potentially once you get there. So The only way the gospel was made relevant in purity culture, oftentimes to our sexuality, is it was a way that our sexual sins could be forgiven, which of course is true, and it's wonderful that that's true. But what I try to do is connect our sexuality to other points of the entire sweep of the story of salvation, including the incarnation, first of all. So for men in particular, there's something really powerful, and for women as well in a different way, I suppose, but there's something really powerful to realizing and sitting with the realization that God the Son became a human being just like us, sexuality included. And to think that Jesus was somehow like neutered or never experienced sexual feelings or sexual desire or anything like that, that's actually flirting with an early church heresy known as Docetism, which takes the view that Jesus wasn't actually human. He just kind of looked like he was human. It was kind of he appeared or seemed to be human. But the church tradition has said strongly, no, he was fully human as well as fully God. And that has implications for our sexuality, because I think it shows that Jesus, Hebrews tells us that Jesus was tempted and tried in every way as we are, yet did not sin. So it is, in fact, possible by the Spirit. We are empowered by the same Spirit that empowered Jesus during his earthly ministry to live lives of, the classical virtue of chastity or of sexual integrity, perhaps to update the language a little bit. That is possible. Number one. Number two, yes, the death of Jesus on the cross means that our sexual sins can be forgiven, but the resurrection is really relevant here too, because we with Christ are raised to new life. And because of the resurrection, the good news of the gospel is that there's a new way to be human. So this goes back to everything we've been saying about purity culture and toxic masculinity, and even men being visual, what we were just talking about. If there's an old order of humanity, an old order of maleness and masculinity, an old script of masculinity where we're kind of helplessly enslaved to our sinful desires, in Christ, there really is now a new way to be human, which means there's a new way to be male. And these are the kind of theological substructures of the Christian story as it relates to our humanity and our sexuality that I think were just not even talked about so oftentimes. And I think these are transformative truths that we can start to teach boys at a young age, and say that there is perhaps as they're growing into their sexuality, a certain immaturity and certain struggles that they may feel, and that, yes, that includes sinning. But the Christian story is a story of growing up and growing up into Christ. And Ephesians 2:15 talks about speaking the truth in love, let us grow up into Christ in all things. He who is our head. So there's this imitation thing, but there's also a transformative element to it. And creating a narrative, replacing the purity paradigm where you need to stay perfect, and if you mess up, it's all ruined, which is anti-gospel, by the way. And replacing it with a paradigm of growing up into Christ. So telling young men, hey, you're going to be feeling new stuff in your body. You're going to be noticing things in the world. You're going to be noticing yourself feeling things about those things in the world, having desires for relationships and connection and oneness with beautiful things and people and all of this. That's like driving a car. You might have some bumps and scrapes along the way. But the goal is not to never scrape the car necessarily. It's actually a longer term goal of growing up and using, I'm developing this analogy more than I have in the past, but finding a way to use the car that actually serves the things that you're trying to do with it and others, and the things that the car was intended for. And the car then becomes a beautiful way of I don't know how well this is working.
We got it.
There's a it becomes, I don't want to say our sexuality is a tool, but in the analogy, the car is something that can be very dangerous. And I think this is what purity culture got right.
Yeah.
Is that it can be severe consequences for some of our sexual choices and foolish mistakes and sins and all that sort of thing. That's not an idle threat. That's a very real thing. But there is a beautiful and mature way to live into this that doesn't need to fall into this purity paradigm and can relate to various parts of the story of salvation in the gospel.
Man, thank you for restating that into the greater gospel narrative, because you're right. We have just copy-pasted Phariseeism and retribution theology and basically karma. You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad, which is not taking the whole gospel of grace into consideration. So thank you, man. I know all of us probably have 10 more questions we could ask you, but guys, if you too listening have more questions, go grab this book, Non-Toxic Masculinity, Recovering Healthy Male Sexuality by Zach Wagner. We recommend it, and we'll also put some links in our show notes to follow and maybe continue the conversation with Zach on the internet. But Zach, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
So I know this was so good for our marriage, wasn't it, Matt? We need to have a good chat tonight, didn't we?
I'm sure we will.
I'm sure we will. Anything stand out, especially to you, Matt?
I think that just the fact that purity culture and kind of the pornified culture both had these like same effects from opposite ends of the dehumanization of women, the dehumanization of men.
Yeah.
Kind of creating this and I wish we could have gotten into it a little more, like the sexual entitlement that can come inside marriage.
Ugh.
That purity culture was like, hey, don't. And then once you're in marriage, like you have to. And just which further kind of reinforces that dehumanization and everything. And so I just to have the hope that, hey, we can relate to people in a very God-honoring way that isn't just solely focused on this one aspect that is potential in a relationship.
That's good, Matt. Steve?
Yeah, there's so much. I think just one thing that wasn't said overtly, it was implied. Zach used the term sexual desire a number of times, but the way he was using that term, I was like, oh, you mean what we've always called sexual temptation.
Oh, snap.
So it puts this negative charge on it where he's just like, sexual desire, it just is. We're sexual beings. It's there. And so I guess what I would add to that is, yes, this can become temptation. It can become sin, but it just starts out as just a part of our humanity.
That's good. And Steve, I did appreciate your historical reflection. I feel bad using the word historical, but that was actually a really helpful ad. I'm sure people appreciated it. I wrote down as a note, just how to talk with my son. So who's 4. And I've been honestly feeling pretty paralyzed because I can engage my girls who are a little bit older in this space at this level. But I just want to learn so much because I don't want to swing the pendulum and I don't want to repeat the sins of our forefathers. So guys, what did you think? Feel free to email us at podcast@lorikrieg.com or follow us on the socials. Send me a message. You guys can feel embarrassed sometimes being like, I'm sure you get too many messages. We don't. We love hearing from you guys. It's really encouraging when we engage this space. We do have a question of the week. Speaking of hearing from you guys, this is a pretty basic one. What's your go-to TV genre? Home reno, Marvel, sci-fi, BBC World Service, mysteries. But guys, if you want to join the conversation, including answering that question of the week, you can find us at Facebook. Just search Hold My Heart Podcast. Thank you again to our guest, Zachary Wagner. Thank you to WCSG, the Zach of all trades, his intern Delaney. And for all of us here at the Hold My Heart Podcast, we will see you next time.